Telecom TV, where ICT connects.
Hello, I'm Martin Warwick and I'm talking with Amy Chappell, who is the Managing Director, Management Consulting at Accenture. Amy, welcome. Let's get down to this and get to the nitty-gritty to begin with. What is big data?
That's a great question, Martin. I think big data is one of these things that in many ways we haven't yet completely defined in a way that everyone accepts. For technologists, it's often about the size of what you can get, but I think for business, it's less about the size and more about the combination of data that we have within our organizations coupled with data that may come from outside and thinking about how you combine those to create value.
It's being said that data is a precious raw material. How do you go about mining it when very often the extraction is difficult and complex?
It's a really great question and analogy, I think. If we look at energy and energy sources, often we look at the vast reserves of resource. And with data, it's no different. There's vast reserves of this resource. Whether it's a bit like the shale, where you are tapping into it and actually the potential is amazing, you've got to figure out how to use it and make it valuable. So I actually think the way you tap into it first is by explore, by experiment, and find your first value nugget within it. And then once you find that, tap further, rather than trying to drill the hole and pop it all out all at once. So it's that start, experiment, learn, keep starting, keep innovating, and then you'll find a lot of resource there.
Has big data's time come, or are we running before we can walk?
Actually, I think whether we want to or not, big data is here. And so we need to learn how to deal with big data. If we don't, I think our competitors will. If we don't, I think other organizations will. Their ecosystem will. And actually, I think consumers want us to deal with the big data. If we're going to collect this kind of information, I think organizations, governments have the responsibility of doing something useful with what they collect that's going to serve their consumers and the general public. So I think we have to learn. The way you learn, though, is often putting it into bite-sized chunks and making sure that those initial small data projects give you insight, and then you can implement from there.
So it's another rerun of the old maxim, if you want to eat an elephant, you do it a bit at a time.
Perhaps, maybe. I think sometimes just starting and getting it embedded into who you are and what you're about and what you do is the first step.
One of the statistics you mentioned today is that 20% of data is usable, while the other may be very difficult to get at. Is it usable? Can you get at it?
I would actually probably frame it just slightly different. I think 80% of what we collect we aren't using to its full potential. So whether it's usable or not usable, I think that's still to be determined. It may be usable by us as organizations in our own business processes, or it may be little gems that actually create insight for other organizations, and we have new opportunities, new revenue streams, new kinds of business that we can build off of that 80%. And I think that's the magic that could happen within big data.
Privacy and confidentiality already inhibitors of small data. I presume they're equally going to be inhibitors of big data.
Privacy is an important thing in thinking about big data, because certainly trust is an important thing. Trust with our consumers that we're going to use that data properly, that we have an end in mind that's going to create an outcome that's worthwhile in using it. And I think as we follow those principles, I think there's a real possibility of creating the right balance between privacy and usefulness of the data that's there. So keeping trust as central to how we go about planning and implementing with this data is important to our organizations.
Using your giant haystacks analogy, how do we go about finding the needle? Or the needle?
That's a great question. I think in my analogy I talked about the fluorescent needles and what we're looking for. I think it's the combination of big data and analytics that helps us to see those fluorescent needles. And when you can combine that and get the insight through the analytics, you have the real possibility to mine them quicker, to mine them faster, to put the center of gravity into the right part of the haystack. And I think that's going to be the key. But that's going to mean that we as organizations are going to have the right people, the deep technologists to understand the data, the curious managers who are data literate and able to ask the right questions, and then the implementers who are able to take that insight and make it work across their organization in a data-rich way.
And this, of course, presupposes there are going to be changes throughout organisations everywhere.
I think change is inevitable today, and I think that actually, whether it was big data that's driving it or just actually the amount of change that's happening in our organisation with globalisation, with different trends that are affecting us, consumers themselves changing, change is inevitable. So big data is actually a tool rather than an inhibitor or rather than even a driver of that change.
Amy Chappell, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Telecom TV, where ICT connects.